1945, February 3rd, Manila, Philippines, 053. Listen, do you hear it? Before I tell you what happened to Manila, I need you to do something for me. I need you to count something ordinary. Count the jars of rice on your shelf. Count the names of the people you ate breakfast with this morning. Count the steps between your front door and your kitchen. Count the windows in your home, each one a square of light that means the world is still out there, still turning, still made of the same air it was made of yesterday. I used to do this every morning. My name is Clara Reyes. I was 23 years old, a school teacher at the Escuela de Santa Magdalena in Intramuros, and every morning before my students arrived, I would stand at the window of my classroom and count things. The mango trees along Calle Real, 7 of them, always 7. The vendors setting up their stalls below, 3 selling bibingka, 1 with green mangoes and shrimp paste, 2 old men with newspapers folded under their arms. The sound of the church bell from San Agustin, always 8 strokes, always the same 8, always promising that the day had the same shape it had the day before. This is a first-person war story set in the Pacific War, 1945, in Manila, Philippines, following a civilian schoolteacher trapped inside a city being unmade. You will live through the slow tightening of a city into a cage, then the shattering of every place you thought was safe, then the long silence that comes after, which is not peace and never will be. And it will not end the way you think, but the moment that decides everything is not a bomb, and it is not a soldier's rifle. It is a door, a specific door on a specific street. And what I chose to do when I heard the knock behind it. Manila heard it all. On the morning of February 3rd, the city felt like a held breath. We knew the Americans were coming. We had known for weeks, in the way you know a storm is coming from the color of the afternoon sky. Word moved through the streets in fragments. The landings at Lingayen Gulf in January, the convoys pushing south through Luzon, the radio broadcasts in careful English that we listened to with our ears pressed against wooden boxes in back rooms. We did not celebrate. You do not celebrate the approach of a battle when you live inside the target. I had spent the night before at school, grading composition papers by candlelight because the electricity had been unreliable for days. My students had written about their families. The assignment was, what does home smell like? And I remember reading their answers and feeling something contract in my chest. Javier had written that home smelled like his mother's adobo and the specific tang of the Pasig River at low tide. Marisol had written that home smelled like her grandfather's tobacco and the wax they used on the chapel floor every Saturday. These were not essays. They were maps of everything the children still had. I walked home before dawn, through streets that were quieter than they should have been. The city had a fever. You could feel it in the absence of things. Fewer dogs barking, fewer vendors, fewer lights in windows. Even the Pasig River looked wrong, too flat and dark, as if it were pretending to be something that couldn't be hurt. My apartment was 4 blocks from the school, on the 2nd floor above a pharmacy that had been out of medicine for 6 weeks. My neighbor, Señora Buenaventura, 60 years old, hair always pinned up with 2 ivory combs, was already awake when I climbed the stairs. She was standing in her doorway in her housecoat, and she said to me without preamble, "I heard artillery last night, from the north." I told her I had heard it too. She looked at the street below us, then back at me. "How many tins of sardines do you have?" I had 4. I told her 4. She nodded once, as if this were a medical diagnosis. "I have 8. If it gets bad, we share." We shook hands on this. It was the most practical conversation I have had in my life. I went inside and sat on my bed and listened. The city was breathing wrong, too shallow, too careful. And then just before 6 in the morning, I heard it. Distant. Layered. A sound that was not quite thunder, but was trying to be. My youngest student, Anna, 7 years old, missing 1 front tooth, had once asked me whether God made thunder or whether thunder just happened. I had told her that thunder was what came after lightning found its home. Standing at my window in the gray half-light of that February morning, listening to that layered, rolling, wrong sound, I thought, something has found its home, and we are inside it. A child's voice floated up from the street below. I looked down and saw a small boy, not one of my students, someone I didn't know, standing on the empty pavement looking up at the sky. He called to someone I couldn't see. "Is it over?" No one answered him. The sound continued. It grew. Nothing was over. Everything was beginning. What none of us understood, standing in our doorways, counting our sardine tins and our rice jars, was that Manila was about to be fought over by two armies, and that we, the people who lived there, were not soldiers, not combatants, not targets in any official military sense. We were simply the city, and the city was about to become the battlefield. The first artillery report said the Americans were north of the city. The Japanese forces, the Manila Naval Defense Force, the Shimbu Group, had been told by Imperial Command that Manila was an open city, that it would not be defended, that the civilians would be spared. General Yamashita had ordered his troops to withdraw, but Admiral Iwabuchi had other orders, or chose to hear them differently. And so 30,000 Japanese naval troops dug into the most beautiful colonial city in Asia and prepared to hold it until there was nothing left to hold. We did not know this yet. On the morning of February 3rd, we were still counting things. Then the order came, though no one gave us an order. The streets simply told us, "Go inside, stay quiet. The city is changing its rules." By the 4th of February, the map of Manila had begun to shrink, not all at once. That's what you have to understand. It wasn't a single catastrophe. It was a series of small amputations. A street you used to walk becomes a street you avoid. A market you visited every Tuesday stops opening. A neighbor's face, usually seen at the morning hour when people beat their rugs and water their plants, simply stops appearing. And each of these small disappearances tightens something around your chest, a slow constriction that you tell yourself is just anxiety, just the nerves of wartime, just temporary. I taught school on February 4th because I did not know what else to do. 3 students came, Javier, Marisol, and a boy named Eduardo, who lived directly behind the school, and whose mother had sent him with a note that said simply, "Please keep him with you until I come." We did not open our readers. We sat near the window and I told them stories, not the stories in the books, but the stories my own grandmother had told me, about the islands before the war, about the mountains of Benguet and the way the rice terraces looked at dawn when the fog was still in the valleys. Stories that had nothing to do with the present. Stories that were an argument for the future. Eduardo fell asleep on his desk. I let him sleep. Outside, the sounds were changing. For several days, the artillery had been coming from the north. That meant the Americans pushing down toward the city, and the Japanese lines somewhere between them and us. But on the evening of February 4th, there was firing from the east as well, and by the 5th, we were hearing it from multiple directions simultaneously. The city was being surrounded by its own rescue. The markets closed without announcement. Owners simply stopped raising the shutters one morning, and that was that. The vegetable sellers vanished. The meat stalls developed that specific smell of things left too long in warm air. Senora Buenaventura's cousin came from Paco district on the 6th, carrying a baby on her back in a cloth bag with 4 sweet potatoes and a rosary. She said she had walked 4 kilometers because the roads north of Paco were being blocked. She said she had seen trucks. She didn't say what kind. People stopped saying names in the street. I noticed this before I understood it. When you greet someone in the Philippines or anywhere really, you say their name. It is a gift. The use of a name. It says, "I see you. I know you. You are specific to me." But by the 5th day of February, people were passing each other on the street with only their eyes, no names. Names draw attention. Names identify you as someone who belongs to someone. In a city that is starting to ask everyone for papers, for reasons, for explanations of existence, a name is a liability. I kept a class register on my desk at school. The attendance book I filled out every morning, 31 names in my careful handwriting, with the date at the top. On February 5th, I wrote the date and stopped. My pen sat on the line. I looked at the names. I thought, if someone finds this book, they will know these children exist, and they will know their addresses, because I had written those too, in case of emergency. The irony of that phrase sat on me like a stone. I closed the book without completing the line. A family on my street, the Mirandas, father and mother and 4 children, the oldest perhaps 14, spent an entire afternoon on the street outside their house, making the decision my blueprint describes in the abstract: church, school, or basement. I watched them from my window. The father, a pharmacist named Rodrigo, stood with his hands in his pockets and looked east, then west, then up at the sky. His wife held the youngest child, a girl, perhaps 2 years old, wearing a dress with smocking on the front. The older children stood in a loose cluster around their parents, their faces wearing the expression children wear when they understand that the adults have stopped having the answers. They went to the church. Santo Domingo was 3 blocks away. Large stone, built by the Spanish in the 17th century and rebuilt after an earthquake. It was famous for its miraculous image of the Virgin. It had thick walls and a high nave, and it could hold, in an emergency, several hundred people. I watched the Miranda family walk toward it with their bundles. The 2 older children each carried a cloth bag. The mother had the little girl on her hip. The pharmacist, last in line, turned back once and looked at his house. The pharmacy shuddered, the windows dark, and then kept walking. I did not follow them to the church that day. Not yet. A rumor reached us on the 8th of February that spread the way fire spreads in dry grass, fast, with its own logic, jumping gaps. The rumor was, they are clearing blocks. No one knew who had said it first. No one could explain exactly what clearing meant, but the word had a shape to it, the shape of something systematic, something bureaucratic, something done with a list, clearing, as if the blocks were a problem to be managed. By that evening, the rumor had details. Someone's cousin had seen Japanese troops going door to door in Ermita, 3 blocks south of the Luneta. They were not looking for weapons. They were not looking for soldiers. They were simply going in and then coming out. I stayed awake that night with the lamp off, listening. My attendance book sat on the table. The date on the last completed line was February 5th, half-written, abandoned. Below it, a dozen empty rows for days that had not yet been recorded. The attendance book with today's date half-written. That night, someone knocked on Senora Buenaventura's door at 11 o'clock. I heard it through the wall. Then I heard her voice, muffled, asking something. Then silence. Then her door closing, carefully, the way you close a door when you don't want anyone to know you're afraid. I lay on my back in the dark and counted the items in my apartment. 4 tins of sardines, 1 bag of rice, 2 boxes of salt crackers, 3 candles, a kerosene lamp with perhaps 2 more days of fuel, 1 bottle of iodine, the attendance book, the rosary my grandmother had given me when I was confirmed, 7 pesos in a tin under the mattress, and the 31 names of my students. I counted these things because they were still here. Because counting things that were still here was how you kept yourself from spending too much time on the things that might not be here tomorrow. The sound from the east was continuous now. Low, rolling, patient, like the ocean before a typhoon. We weren't where we thought we were. The safe parts of the map were running out of ink. What I am about to tell you about February 9th, I have rehearsed this many times. I have rehearsed the order of the details because the order matters. When something unthinkable happens, your brain records it out of sequence. The way a camera with a broken shutter records light, in fragments, in flashes, in an order that doesn't match the clock. I will give you the order as best I can reconstruct it, and I want to tell you what it felt like in the apartment before that morning. Because context is not the same as excuse, but it is necessary for the truth. By the 9th, we had been inside for nearly a week. The apartment had taken on the quality of a place where time has stopped moving. Not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening outside could not be tracked the way normal time is tracked. Normal time is marked by meals and arrivals and departures, and the ringing of church bells and the changing of light. None of these things were working properly. The bells at San Agustin had gone silent on the 6th. Meals were what we could make from what we had, eaten when hunger demanded rather than when the clock suggested. Arrivals, there were none, because no one came. Departures, there were none because we did not leave. What remained was a kind of suspended present, thick, close, warm with the February heat and the sealed windows, smelling of our own breathing and the sardines and the kerosene lamp that we used only when we absolutely had to. It was mid-morning. I had been awake since 4. Senora Buenaventura was with me. She had knocked on my door at 6, and I had let her in without either of us saying anything, and we had been sitting at my kitchen table drinking weak tea and not talking, when we heard the boots. Not our boots. Not the shuffling of neighbors. The particular sound of military boots on wooden stairs, a rhythm, a weight, an economy of motion that has no uncertainty in it. When soldiers move, they move as if the ground owes them passage. You learn to hear the difference. Senora Buenaventura set down her cup. Her hand went to the 2 ivory combs in her hair. A reflex. The way a person touches their face when they're frightened. We looked at each other. The boots stopped at the landing outside our doors. A pause. Then a knock. Not loud, not polite either. Functional. A knock that is also a statement. My neighbor across the hall, a young man named Vicente, a clerk at a shipping company. A quiet person who had before the war kept a small garden of orchids on his windowsill, opened his door. I heard him open it. I heard the exchange of voices, brief, in a language I didn't speak but whose tone I understood perfectly. Compliance being requested, compliance being given. Then something happened that I have never been able to describe precisely. There was a sound, not a shot, nothing so clean, something else. Something that was over very quickly and then was replaced by silence. Señora Buenaventura had both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were very wide. She shook her head once. Not no, more like the involuntary movement of someone trying to clear water from their ears, trying to reset what they had heard to something it wasn't. We did not move for 11 minutes. I counted. I counted seconds because it was the only thing I could do that had any shape to it. The boots went back down the stairs. Different rhythm going down. Heavier, slower, as if carrying something additional. Or perhaps I imagined this. Perhaps memory has edited the boots to match what I understood later they had done. When I finally opened my door, when enough silence had stacked up to make the hallway feel possible, I saw the orchids. Vicente had placed several of his orchids in a clay pot outside his door. 3 of them, purple and white, still alive. I don't know when he had put them there. Before the knock, maybe. As if he had known somehow what was coming, and had placed something beautiful outside his door like a last argument against whatever came next. One of the orchid pots had been knocked over. The flowers were crushed against the hallway floor, petals already beginning to bruise. The dirt had spilled in an arc that looked almost decorative. I stood at Vicente's door for a long time. Long enough that Señora Buenaventura came to stand beside me. We did not go in. We were not ready, I think, to see what confirming it would cost us. I had known Vicente Fuentes for 2 years, as long as I had lived in the building. He was 28 years old. He worked for the Elizalde shipping company, which meant he spent his days at a desk near the port, tracking the movement of cargo vessels in and out of Manila Bay. He was quiet in the way some people are quiet, who have very active inner lives, always reading, always with a book tucked under his arm when he passed me on the stairs. He had once, the previous Christmas, left a small poinsettia plant outside my door without a note, and when I thanked him for it, he had turned a color I recognized as embarrassment and said only, it was extra. He was the kind of person who keeps orchids. I stood outside his door and I thought all of this, in the order I'm telling it to you, because thinking about the poinsettia and the book under his arm and the employment at the shipping company was a way of making him specific, of asserting his specificity against the thing that was trying to erase it. He was not an abstraction. He was a man who kept orchids and brought extra poinsettias. Whatever had happened to him had happened to that specific person. Instead, I looked down at the floor of the hallway, and I saw one of his shoes. Just one. A brown leather Oxford, the kind he wore to the shipping office. It was sitting upright, slightly askew, against the baseboard, as if it had been placed there by someone who expected the owner to come back for it. You understand, when you see a shoe without its owner, that the rules have changed. Not may change, have changed. The shoe is the announcement. The shoe is the door into the new world. That afternoon, I helped Señora Buenaventura move everything she owned that was worth keeping into my apartment. We worked fast and we didn't talk. We moved her rosary, her photographs, her food, her medicines, her 2 ivory combs in a small velvet pouch. We blocked the door with my wardrobe. We sat in the kitchen, and we did not light the lamp. I smelled, that afternoon for the first time, what I would come to know as the smell of that month. Smoke from across the city, blended with something sweet and thick underneath it. A smell that has no clean name in any language I know, because it is a smell that people are not supposed to have to know. Smoke, sweetness, rot, these 3 things together. My hands were shaking when I hid Señora Buenaventura's good pearl earrings inside an empty can of sardines. Not because I was cold. The day was warm, the way February in Manila always is. Close, humid, the air with weight to it. My hands shook because they had understood something that my mind was still trying to refuse. Outside, on a different street, a prayer was being said. Someone was praying loudly. Too loudly, the loudness of someone who has passed the point where prayer is a private conversation and entered the territory where it is the only sound left. The prayer stopped. The silence that replaced it said everything. What does it cost you to understand that your building has changed, that the person across the hall is gone, that the sound you heard was the sound of that the shoe by the baseboard is the last testimony of a man who kept orchids? It cost you something you do not have a name for, something essential, something you will spend the rest of your life trying to account for. And that is how the first door fell, in my telling of it. Not with fire, not with a dramatic assault, with boots on stairs and a single shoe and the smell of smoke and something sweet that I did not want to name. Then we heard it from further down the street. Another building, another floor. We heard it through the walls, through the shut windows, through the weight of the warm February air. It was moving closer, and we had already run out of somewhere else to go. We went to the church on February 11th. This was not a sudden decision. It was a decision that had been building for 3 days. 3 days of listening to the city rearrange itself around us. 3 days of Señora Buenaventura and I eating crackers and sharing a single candle and taking turns sleeping so that one of us was always awake. By the morning of the 11th, the building below us had been entered twice. We had heard it. The same rhythm of boots, the same formal knock, the same terrible economy of sound, and we had sat in my kitchen with our backs against the wall and our hands in our laps and waited. We could not stay. The apartment was becoming a room-sized trap. Santo Domingo was 3 blocks east, and those 3 blocks felt, that morning, like the most exposed ground I had ever tried to cross. We wore our plainest clothes. Señora Buenaventura tucked her rosary inside her blouse. I carried the cloth bag with our food, and I tucked the school attendance book under the food at the bottom of the bag. I don't know why I took it. I wasn't thinking clearly. I took it because it had 31 names in it, and leaving it felt like abandoning the children who had written about the smell of home. The street was wrong. The light was normal. Mid-morning, Manila, February light. The kind that usually feels like reassurance. But the street was wrong in the way an empty theater is wrong, all the architecture of human life, and none of the life. A bicycle was leaning against a wall, a pot of geraniums sat by a door, an empty milk glass stood on a windowsill. These things said, people were here this morning. The absence of the people said the rest. We walked fast, without running, because running would have made us visible in a different way. Santo Domingo was already full when we arrived. I had never seen it like that. I had attended Mass there on Sundays since I was 12, and I knew the naive the way you know a room you love, the way it sounds when full, the particular quality of the stone under your feet, the smell of incense that has soaked into the walls over 3 centuries. What I had not seen was the naive filled with this particular kind of fullness, 300 people, perhaps more, sitting and standing and kneeling, children pressed against parents, old people on the pew seats, younger people standing in the aisles, everyone with bags and bundles, and the specific posture of people who have brought everything they thought they could carry and already know it wasn't enough. The stone columns of the nave were buttressed with people the way a harbor is buttressed with boats in a storm. Everyone pressed to the nearest solid thing. Old women sat in the carved wooden confessionals with the doors open, which struck me in a detached way as both practical and deeply strange. The baptismal font near the entrance had become a water vessel around which people moved with careful deliberateness, filling bottles and cups, rationing what was there. 2 teenage boys had climbed up to the choir loft and sat there with their legs dangling, looking down at the crowd below with the particular expression of young people confronting something for which their youth has provided no framework. They looked like students on the first day of a class they hadn't signed up for. A nurse was moving through the crowd, a woman perhaps 10 years older than me, in a white uniform that was no longer fully white, her hair pinned up with medical efficiency. She was checking on people methodically, crouching by the elderly, checking pulses, asking about medications, keeping her voice very low and very calm. Her name was Esperanza, and she had, she told me later, been awake for 36 hours. Her hands were steady. I have thought about Esperanza's hands many times in the years since. They were the hands of someone who had made a decision at some point, consciously or not, that the hands would keep working regardless of what the rest of the person was experiencing. The hands had a contract with the world that the rest of her was not required to honor. She moved through that crowd the way water moves, finding the lowest point, the place of greatest need, the space between people that someone needed to fill. There was a priest, Father Domingo, heavyset, with a voice made for large spaces. He was moving through the crowd in the other direction from Esperanza, stopping to pray with people, to touch foreheads, to listen. He was performing the office of his life with the particular calm of a man who has decided that calm is the only thing he still has to offer. Children were crying quietly, not loudly, as children usually cry, but the muted crying of children who have been told, somehow, by the adults around them, that loud sound is dangerous. This is a terrible thing to see, a child's face doing everything a crying face does, but with the sound turned down. By noon, the church held perhaps 400 people. The walls were thick enough. The doors were heavy enough. The presence of the priest and the nurse and the image of the Virgin and the 300-year-old stone gave people the feeling, the illusion of sanctuary, of a place that had been set aside from the ordinary operations of cruelty by something older than any army. I did not entirely believe this, but I stayed because there was nowhere else. That afternoon, a man near the side door, a middle-aged man in a businessman's suit, carrying a briefcase that he had apparently not let go of since leaving his house, stood up and announced that he was going to try to get to his house 3 blocks north. He had medicine there, he said. He had information about the situation to the north, he said. He needed to go. The people near him looked at him with the particular expression of people who understand something he doesn't yet understand. One man reached out and touched his arm. The businessman went to the side door. He opened it a crack. He looked out. He closed it again. He stood at the door for 30 seconds. Then he sat back down and put his briefcase across his knees and did not speak again. We stayed. By evening, the crowd in the church had generated its own weather. The warm, damp air of hundreds of bodies, the smell of sweat and fear and the candles burning at the altar, the sounds of children finally sleeping, of prayers muttered in Spanish and Tagalog and Cebuano, and things that were no longer words. Someone had a baby, a very small baby, perhaps 2 months old, who had been sleeping through everything with the magnificent indifference of the very new. When the baby finally cried, really cried, the sound seemed enormous in that stone space, enormous and ordinary at once. The cry that says, "I am here, I am alive, I need something." Senora Buenaventura held the baby while its mother rested. I watched her hold it. This 60-year-old woman with her ivory combs and her 8 cans of sardines and her practical handshake, and she held that baby the way you hold something you know might be taken from you. The rosary she always wore under her blouse was in her hand now, the beads moving through her fingers. Then, from outside the church walls, not close but not far, a sound. Then it got closer. Then there were boots outside, and voices, and the crowd in the church became very still. All at once, the way 400 bodies become still when they understand simultaneously that the place they chose as refuge is about to prove itself one thing or the other. And then, in the quiet, a small girl's voice said, "Mama, is the bad thing coming?" And the rosary in Senora Buenaventura's hand snapped. The beads scattered across the stone floor of the church, rolling in every direction, bouncing off the kneelers and the pew legs and coming to rest in the spaces between things. The sound of them, small, rhythmic, like teeth on stone, was the only sound in the church for a long moment. We held our breath. 400 of us, together. Manila heard it all. I will not give you a single scene. I will give you what actually happened, which was not one terrible thing but a sequence of terrible things with no clean boundaries between them. A wave function of horror that peaked and receded and peaked again over days, each wave starting before the previous one had fully finished. What I am describing is the period from February 13th to February 20th, which is a week in the calendar and something unmeasurable in any other unit. The first wave was sound. Before you see anything, you hear it. The city outside the church was producing sounds that I had no prior category for. Sounds that my brain tried to match against its existing library of known things and kept failing. There was the sustained artillery that was familiar by now. The American guns north of the river, the Japanese guns answering. But underneath and around it there were other sounds. Human sounds. The kind that come from somewhere before language, from the place in the throat that hasn't been trained by civilization. I lay on the church floor at night and listened to the city screaming, and the screaming was not one sound but a texture, a fabric of individual sounds woven together until they became something like weather, a condition you were inside that you could not get outside of. There is a stage beyond fear that I don't have a proper name for. Fear is an active state, the heart racing, the breath shortening, the body preparing to run or fight. What comes after sustained fear, after fear has been running continuously for days without any option to run or fight, is something else. The body cannot sustain the full chemistry of fear indefinitely. It begins to conserve, to ration, to enter a kind of managed emergency state. You can think clearly, you can act efficiently, but you have crossed into a territory where the stakes no longer register emotionally the way they should, where you can hear something through a wall and process it as information before you process it as horror. I recognized, somewhere around the third day in the church, that this had happened to me. It frightened me, this secondary fear, the fear of my own emotional arithmetic, more than the sounds through the walls did. On the night of the 14th, I was near the side wall of the church when I heard, very clearly, through 6 inches of stone, the voice of a person saying something in Tagalog that translated, approximately, as "Please, we are not soldiers, please." The voice was not screaming. That was the worst part. The voice was clear and careful, as if the speaker believed that clarity and care would be understood as arguments, as if the right arrangement of words could interrupt what was happening. I pressed my back against the stone wall, and I did not move. The stone against my back was cool, which registered as a distinct sensation in a way that stone temperature does not, under normal circumstances, register. The coolness was real. I pressed myself against it and I counted the coolness. In the church, survivors had organized themselves in a way that looked, from above, I imagined it from above, as a way of making it smaller, like the organized chaos of a ship in rough water. Esperanza, the nurse, had a corner of the sacristy where she was treating wounds, cuts, burns, injuries from collapsed buildings, a woman whose shoulder had been dislocated, and who sat with a face made of such controlled endurance that it was almost beautiful. Father Domingo had not stopped moving, had not, as far as I could tell, slept. On the 16th, they came into the church. I will not give you every detail. I will give you the shape of it. They came in the front. There were approximately 12 of them. They were not interested in Father Domingo's authority, or the image of the Virgin, or the 3 centuries of stone. They moved through the crowd with purpose, not random, not frenzied, but systematic, which was in some ways more terrible than frenzy would have been. Systematic means there is a logic. Systematic means someone has thought about this and made decisions about how it should be done. I was in the sacristy with Esperanza when we heard the change in the crowd's sound. When 400 people's collective breath becomes something else, something compressed and explosive, held in until it detonates, you hear the transition before you understand it. We put our backs against the far wall of the sacristy. There was a cabinet, heavy, oak, containing the vestments and vessels of the church, and we pulled it across in front of us and crouched behind it and did not breathe. In the dark behind the cabinet, in the smell of old wood and incense and our own sweat, I was aware of every detail of my body in a way I am not usually aware of. The pressure of the stone floor against my knees, the weight of my cloth bag across my back, the roughness of the wooden cabinet against my fingertips, Esperanza's breath, which was slower and more controlled than mine, a nurse's discipline, a body trained to metabolize crisis differently, my own breath, which I was controlling consciously, counting 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out, hold for 2. A rhythm I had read about once in a pamphlet about anxiety, and had thought at the time was perhaps an overreaction to ordinary distress. I thought of the pamphlet. I thought of the person who had written it, sitting at a desk somewhere, in a world that contained desks. In the main nave there were sounds. I have told this story to 3 people in my lifetime. Each time, I have stopped at this point and said, there are things I will not describe, not because they didn't happen, and not because you don't deserve to know, but because the describing of them gives them a shape that they do not deserve to have. They were shapeless. They were wrong. That is the full description. Behind the oak cabinet, in the dark of the sacristy, I listened. Esperanza had my hand. Her grip was the grip of someone who has decided that grip is the only form of medicine she still has to offer. The sounds in the nave went on. Then there was a silence. Then they began again, from a different direction, outside the church now, around the north wall, hopscotching through the neighborhood, block by block. When I emerged from behind the cabinet, a long time later, how long I don't know, time had stopped working, the church looked different, the crowd had rearranged itself, people had moved against walls. There were spaces in the crowd where there had not been spaces before. Father Domingo was on his knees at the altar, praying aloud in Latin, the words coming from him in a continuous stream, as if stopping the words would stop something else. A baby was crying. The same baby as before, or a different one. I couldn't tell. I sat down on the stone floor next to Senora Buenaventura, who was still holding her broken rosary, or the pieces of it, the chain and several beads she had managed to gather. Her face was the face of someone who has arrived somewhere they never expected to arrive and is still trying to believe in the map. She had tied the remaining beads together with a piece of thread she had pulled from the hem of her blouse. It was not a rosary anymore. It was a repair, an insistence, a refusal to let the thing be entirely undone. I opened my mouth to say something to her. Anything and nothing came out. My voice had left me. Then, from somewhere in the church, a sound that broke through my numbness like a stone through ice, a child's cough, a small, ordinary cough, the kind a child makes when they have a cold, the most everyday sound in the world, and behind the cough, a name being murmured. Someone calling a child's name softly, the way you call a name when you are trying not to wake a room. Marisol, someone said, and then again. Marisol. It was not my student. I knew that. There were many Marisols in Manila, but the name hit me somewhere very specific, and I started crying, not loudly, the muted crying of the people in this church, the soundless crying, and my voice came back just enough for me to say the only thing I had left to say. Manila heard it all. Manila heard it all. There was a family in the church, a mother, 3 children, a grandmother who was perhaps 80 and who had come wearing her best dress, as if for mass. The family was from Paco district, displaced 3 times before they reached Santo Domingo. The mother was perhaps 35, with the particular competence of someone accustomed to managing everything alone. Her husband, she told people quietly, was not with them. She did not explain further. Their youngest child was sick. A fever, not from injury, just from fear and displacement, and the impossibility of keeping a small body healthy in these conditions. The child needed rest and water and medicine, and we had none of these things in adequate supply. The grandmother, a tiny woman named Lola Caring, which was not a name I learned but a title of endearment that everyone in the family used for her, sat with the sick child in her lap and did the thing grandmothers do. She sang, barely audibly, a folk song about birds and rivers that I half recognized, the kind of song that exists in every Filipino family because it was passed mouth to ear for so many generations that no one remembers the original composer. The sick child lay in her lap and watched the high-vaulted ceiling of the church with the heavy-lidded attention of a fever patient. The grandmother sang. I have thought many times since about what it takes to sing under those conditions. Not the mechanics of it, the breath, the voice, what it takes in terms of some interior decision that says, I will perform an act of normalcy. I will insist, with my voice, that there is a world in which this child and I are in our own home, and there is no artillery and no one has died, and the birds in the song are real birds in a real river. The grandmother's singing was not an escape from reality. It was an argument with it. On the morning of the 17th, the mother came to me, because I was a teacher and therefore, in the logic of desperation, might know something. She asked if there was anywhere else to go. She had heard there was a building 2 blocks north, a large private house, stone construction with a cellar where some families had organized themselves. I told her I had also heard this. I also told her what I knew about what was happening in the streets between here and there. She looked at me with the eyes of someone calculating odds that shouldn't have to be calculated. Behind her, across the church, I could see a man. I didn't know his name. I had been watching him for 2 days, who had over the course of those 2 days transformed in ways I had watched with a kind of horrified fascination. He had arrived with a family, I thought, a woman and 2 older children near him on the first day. By the second day, the woman was still there but seemed separate from him. By the third day, I noticed that his bag, a large canvas bag, had grown. He was hoarding. Not dramatically, not obviously, but systematically, in the same way the troops had moved through the church, with a logic, with a list. I had seen him twice when people were distracted, slip items from the communal pile, the food people had been sharing from their bags, the medicines from Esperanza's corner, into his canvas bag. I watched him push past an elderly man to get to the water jar. I watched him not look at the elderly man's face. What I am describing is not evil in any grand sense. I want to be careful about this because it would be easy and false to make him into a villain, and Manila had actual villains who require no inflation. What I am describing is a man in whom the calculation of survival had displaced, temporarily or permanently, the reflexes of social belonging. He still moved among us, he still occupied the same stone floor, but he had drawn a line around himself, and he was on the inside of it, and we were on the outside of it, and everything he did was in service of that distinction. I recognized it because I had felt the beginning of that same calculation in myself, that moment a few days earlier when I had measured Senora Buenaventura's cough and wondered very briefly whether her presence near me was a net cost. I had recognized the thought and been ashamed of it and turned away from it. The man with the canvas bag had not turned away. I had a decision to make. If I said something, it would cause a confrontation in a space where confrontation was dangerous. If I said nothing, it would continue. And then there was the other decision. The one I have thought about every day since. A woman came to me, not someone I knew, middle-aged, with a terrible cut on her forearm that Esperanza had bandaged. And she said in a whisper that her husband was hidden in the back of the church, behind the altar, and that he was badly hurt, and that she had hidden him there because she thought she had been told that the men were being taken specifically. She said, "Can I trust you to not say where he is, if they ask?" I said yes. 2 hours later, a different woman, someone I had spoken with briefly on the first day in the church, who had been sitting near me, and Senora Buenaventura, asked me directly, "Are there any men hiding in here?" She asked in the tone of someone who has a reason to know. She looked at me steadily. I said no. This is the city's new language. Don't look, don't ask, don't remember. I said it directly, and I held her gaze and I said no. I don't know of any men hiding here. And she looked at me for one long second, and then looked away. I do not know if she believed me. I do not know if she was asking because she was afraid for herself, or afraid for him, or afraid for someone else entirely. There was a time before all of this when I would have tried to understand the full shape of the situation before making a decision. That time was over. The city had taught me to decide with incomplete information in seconds, with everything at stake, and to live with what the decision had cost. The man with the canvas bag had, by the end of that day, a bag so full it could barely close. He sat with his back against the wall, and his arm around it, and his eyes going from person to person in the way eyes go when they have started to calculate everything. I looked at him for a long time. I am not a cruel person. I am not an angry person, usually. But I looked at this man and I felt something in my chest that had not been there before, something hard and particular. A new faculty that the war had installed in me without my consent. I looked at him and thought, "You are teaching me something about what people become, and I am going to have to decide whether I am willing to become it." I gave the rest of my sardines to the woman with the sick child, all 4 tins which I had been rationing for days. I put them in her hands and closed her fingers around them, and she looked at me with an expression I will not try to describe, because the English and Tagalog languages both fall short of it. Then I went back to my corner and sat with Senora Buenaventura, and she touched my hand, and we sat in the darkening church and listened to the city outside continue to make its terrible weather. From the street below the church's high windows, a sound, a brass nameplate being ripped from a door somewhere nearby, the metallic wrenching of it, brief and specific, identity stolen, just like that. Then the city asking, again, who you were, and you understanding, finally, that the answer to that question was something you were still choosing, moment by moment, in the dark. The shooting in our immediate area stopped, for us, for the section of the city around Santo Domingo, around February 20th, though the battle for Manila continued until March. The Japanese forces were compressed into the old walled city, Intramuros, and the Americans were shelling them out of it, and what was left of Manila was being divided into the geography of horror, blocks that had been cleared, blocks that were still contested, blocks that had burned. When we finally opened the church doors and went into the street, the city we stepped into was not the city we had come from. I knew this before I could see it clearly. The light was wrong, too bright, too open, because the buildings that had been blocking the view to the east were gone, not damaged, gone. The street to the east of the church was a landscape of rubble and ash, and the strange forensic disorder of catastrophe. A chair upright in the middle of the street, unmolested, as if someone had simply placed it there. A ceiling fan embedded in a pile of debris, its blades still perfectly intact. A wall with its family photographs still hanging, the wall standing alone without the house behind it, the photographs of strangers looking out over an altered world. I moved through the streets with the particular gait of someone who has learned in the preceding weeks to move carefully, to test each step before committing weight, to read the surface before trusting it. The rubble was unpredictable. It settled and shifted. Pipes and beams emerged from it at angles that made no architectural sense. The smell was everywhere, that smoke and sweetness that I had first smelled in my apartment 3 weeks before, now so thick and constant that my brain had almost stopped registering it as a smell and started processing it as weather, a condition of the air itself. I was looking for my students. I had 31 names. I had addresses, all written in the attendance book that I had carried in the bottom of my cloth bag through everything. And I was going to use those addresses to find whatever I could find. The first address I tried, the family of Eduardo, the boy whose mother had sent him to school with a note saying, "Please keep him with you." They had lived on a street 3 blocks north of the school. The street was there, the geography was mostly there, the shape of it, the approximate locations of where buildings had been. But the building was not. I stood in front of the space where Eduardo's house had been. There was a man nearby, sitting on a piece of wall, wrapped in something that might have been a curtain. I asked him about the family who had lived there. He told me the family had gone, 3 weeks ago, to relatives in the south. He said this with the particular emphasis of someone for whom went south was the best possible version of events. I wrote Eduardo's name in the attendance book, and next to it I wrote, "Family evacuated south." Maybe. I didn't know if this was true. I wrote it because the alternative, the blank space, the not knowing, was something I could not look at. I tried 6 more addresses. The results were various. 2 families who had fled south or north or east before the worst had come. Information passed along by neighbors who were themselves fragments of larger information chains. 1 family whose house was entirely intact and inside which I found, after knocking and waiting and knocking again, a grandmother and 2 grandchildren who had not left, who had spent the entire period in their cellar, who opened the door to me with expressions that had been cleared of all effect and were slowly, as they recognized that I was a person and not a threat, beginning to reconstitute something that might eventually become relief. And 1 address, the Villanueva family, a father, mother, and their daughter Rosario, 11 years old, who had once written an essay for me about how her father sang in the bath where I found nothing except the house, intact and the door unlocked, and the interior arranged exactly as a family arranges their interior when they intend to return. Dishes in the drying rack, books on the shelf, a photograph on the sideboard, the 3 of them, Rosario in a white dress, at what looked like a birthday celebration. I stood in the Villanueva family's kitchen for a long time. Senora Buenaventura was with me. She stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph and looked at me and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the photograph hadn't already said more precisely. I found proof of them. I did not find them. I took nothing from the house. I closed the door carefully behind me as if that mattered, as if the careful closing of a door could hold something in. In the attendance book, next to Rosario's name, I wrote the date, just the date. I couldn't write anything else. The streets I moved through that day, and the next were populated by people in the same condition I was in, moving through the altered geography of the city with the particular searching posture of those who have lost someone or something and are not yet ready to be finished looking. People carried photographs. People asked the same question, the one without words, the one your body asks just by the way you walk and look and stop and look again. We passed each other in the rubble the way people pass each other in a library. Quiet, purposeful, each on our own search, briefly aware of each other and then not. A woman I had never met fell into step beside me for half a block and then stopped at a pile of rubble and began to move pieces of it aside methodically, and I stopped too, and we worked together for 20 minutes without speaking, and then she found what she was looking for, a wooden box, small, painted blue, and she held it against her chest and walked away without looking at me. I never learned her name. I think about her often. We won. The Americans took the city. The Japanese forces were annihilated in Intramuros. By March 3rd, Manila was officially liberated. These are the facts of military victory. 100,000 civilians were dead. Those are the facts of everything else. I am talking to you now from a distance of many years, and I want to be careful about what I give you at the end. I don't want to give you resolution, because there wasn't one. I don't want to give you meaning, because the meaning of 100,000 dead is not something I am qualified to assign. I don't want to give you the comfort of the lesson, the idea that from horror wisdom flowers, because while that is sometimes true, it asks the dead to justify themselves, and I won't ask that. What I want to give you is this. 6 weeks after the liberation, when the rubble clearing had begun, and the streets were becoming navigable again, I went back to my school. The building was damaged, part of the roof had fallen in, and one wall of my classroom was open to the sky, but the structure stood. I walked through the debris into the classroom. Some of the desks were still there. The wall where I had hung the students' drawings was still there. Though the drawings were gone, burned, or blown away, I didn't know. And on the floor, in the corner, I found the attendance book. Not mine. Mine was in my bag, where it had been the whole time. This was an earlier one, from the year before. My handwriting, but a different year's names. 30 students from 1943, the year I had started teaching at this school. I picked it up. The pages were warped by damp and ash, but the names were legible. I sat down at one of the remaining desks, and I opened the book, and I read the names, all 30 of them. I read them aloud, slowly, the way you read names at a memorial, because that is what it was. Some of those students I had heard from, by that point, through the web of neighborhood information that Manila had reconstructed out of grief and determination. Others I had not. I read the names anyway. Then I took out my own attendance book, the one from February 1945, with the half-completed date in the upper right corner, and I picked up a pencil, and I completed the date, February 5th, 1945. Then I turned the page, February 6th, February 7th. Every day forward to the present, I wrote the date, and in the column I wrote one name, whoever had survived, whoever I had confirmed. Slowly the pages filled, not all of them, not most of them, but some. This is the act of defiance that I offer you. Not heroism, not triumph. The act of writing a name down, of saying this person existed, and I will not allow them to be erased by the magnitude of what happened around them. My grandmother's rosary was broken, somewhere in the church. Its beads scattered on the stone floor. I never recovered it. What I have instead is the attendance book, and the 6 names I still add to it every year. The students I have found over the decades, who went south or north or east and came back, or who survived somewhere and were eventually traceable through the living city's long memory. If you ever think a city is just buildings, remember Manila. A city is its people's voices and their names and the things they counted in the morning to prove the world was still there. A city is the way rice smells when someone's mother is cooking, and the sound of church bells, and the 7 mango trees along Calle Real that may or may not be there now. I can't tell you. Manila heard it all. The boots on the stairs, and the prayers in the dark, and the baby coughing, and the rosary beads on the stone floor, and the brass nameplate torn from the door, and the silence that came after, which was not peace, but which was at least the absence of the screaming, and which was underneath, below the level you could hear, the living going on. I am still going on. Rosario Villanueva, if you are somewhere, if you can hear this. I wrote your name down. I write it every year. You are not erased. None of you are erased. The attendance book sits on my desk. The names are written in it. The city is rebuilt around them, imperfectly, loudly, alive. Manila heard it all, and it still remembers.